Hello, welcome again to Racecraft. This is the second half of the Sigma Diff conversion. So as you can see, I've already cut the main part of the diff off here. I didn't bother filming all of that because it's just grinding. So anyway, that piece is cut off, but I've kept this area here because what I want to show you is how to make a jig for aligning these axle tubes when you put them into the big Borg-Warner diff. Right, so once we've got all of this cast iron cut off here, and this axle tube has to go into our big Borg-Warner diff, we've got to get the two axle tubes lined up. Not only lined up with each other, but also lined up with the new housing, because you've got the pinion angle on the front of the diff. So this is how I did it. There's any number of ways to actually do this, but I found this was the simplest way. So I cut a little bit of steel, a little strap of steel that's going to go into those two bolt holes there. Now the lucky thing is that those two bolt holes there are at about the same spacing as your big Borg-Warner diff. So all I've done is drill these two holes, same spacing at that, and then I've filed that hole just a little bit so it'll fit onto the big Borg-Warner. So I'm going to bolt that on there. Now, this piece of steel, I'm going to weld to that edge there. It's got to be welded onto the side there so you have access to the bolts. But basically what the plan here is to line this edge up with this edge here. Now you can sight that and you can get it surprisingly close, and this actually works better than you think it will. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to tack this on, then I'm going to sight it along that edge so those two are perfectly in line with each other, and once I'm happy with the angle then I'll fully weld it. So now I'm just going to put a little tack in the corner there. Yes. Alright, so I've got my little bracket made up here, it's bolted onto those holes, and that angle there now matches that angle there, and all you have to do is just sight down the diff. When you've got one axle tube into the new diff, you can take this off, put it on the opposite side, line up the other axle. Then to make sure that both of them are really precise, you can always lay a piece of metal across here and on the opposite side and just make sure the two of them are lined up. As simple as this may seem, it actually works remarkably well. You do get a really good accurate pinion angle. Now, in order to get the rest of this off the axle tube without damaging the axle tube, what I do is I get my little 1mm wide wheel and I cut down along the length either side of where this weld is. Then I go in and I grind almost all of the weld out. Now here's the one off the other side, and you can see I've cut down the side down there and I've left a little bit of material there. When you grind through this, you'll get to a stage where a little line will form all the way around where the weld hasn't actually taken to the cast iron that far down. Once you've got to that point and you've split this in a couple of spots, you just knock it off with a hammer. So I'll take this outside now, I'll do the cuts, and I'll show you what we end up with once all these bits are off. One of the comments that I had when I did the first half of this conversion was someone said to me, wouldn't it be easier just to cut the axle tube and sleeve it and weld it together? Yes and no. In this case, no. With cutting the axle tube, you've got to cut it somewhere where you can actually do the sleeving together. But when you have a look at this thing, look how many brackets you've got on here. The problem is, where are you going to cut the tube and maintain all of the brackets? Well, there isn't anywhere. Even this last bracket here sits right over the top, so you can't even get into there somewhere to cut it. So about the only way you'd be able to do it is maybe cut this bracket all the way off so you could cut the axle tube, then weld this back on again. But then of course you've got all the alignment problems and all the grinding and everything. To try and take this bracket off and take it off in one piece without cutting it up. So no, cutting the axle tube and sleeving it really does not work. The best way is to pull this off and press it into the new housing. So in order to get all this, now you're going to have to get all of this cast iron off the end. Now I've already cut it so I can demonstrate what you've got to do. So what you're going to do is you're going to do lengthwise cuts, but you can't cut so deep that you cut into the axle tube. If you do, you'll have an oil leak because you'll make a little channel. So what I've done here is I've cut down the length and then broken that piece off, hit it with a hammer and broken it off. So then you're going to do another cut, another couple of cuts, and you're going to break another piece off. Now, when you get to the welds, you're going to grind right down to the weld. Now you don't have to grind into the axle tube, because what you'll see is the edge of the weld where it doesn't actually bond to the cast iron as you get closer to the axle tube. So you'll see like this little cracked area around here. Once you get to that point, you can stop there because the tube will come off. I'll just turn this around and I'll show you the other side. There's probably a better view of what it looks like when you grind down to that stage. So you'll see the split all the way around. Give it a good smack with a hammer and it'll come right off. Then this weld that protrudes up, you're just going to go in there with maybe a flat disc or your grinder and just carefully grind all that off flush with the tube. But the important thing is that when you're doing your cuts along the length is not to cut into the tube. Now, one of the things I forgot to mention right at the beginning of this, before you start cutting up your diff, get your tape measure out and measure it from flange to flange. So when you press it, these axle tubes into your big diff, you get the correct width. You can't narrow the diff by pressing these in deeper because all these brackets will end up in the right place. So you're going to end up with a diff that is standard width. If you did want to narrow it a bit, you'd have to cut it up at this end and take some of the length out of here. But Sigmas have got nice big generous wheel arches and you'll fit an 8-9 inch rim in there without cutting the diff up or anything like that. So once you've got your welds ground down and you've got the axle tube nice and smooth, what I like to do is get a piece of emery cloth and just go around the tube and just give it a polish up, get the rust, scale, old oil and everything off there. So when you go to press it into your new diff, it's nice and smooth and clean. We've got our two axle tubes ready. As you can see, it's cut up, but you can see how much smaller your little Sigma diff is to the big Falcon Warner. One of the things that you will need to do on your big diff is on the ends here, these little flanges, these little extensions here, you're going to have to cut those back to where that thick ring is. Because when you press your axle tubes in, they will go almost right up to that edge. If you leave that bit on there, you'll never get them in quite deep enough. So I'll get this all set. We'll put it in the press. We'll get our angle gauge out, gauge where the arms have to sit, and start pressing it together. We're finally at the good part of this conversion, the assembly part. I've got my axle tubes all set to go here. I had them bead blasted and just threw a little bit of black paint on them just to stop them from going rusty. The ends are nice and clean and we're ready to start putting them into the diff. But before we do that, I'd like to show you something. This is part of the old Sigma diff. It's actually this bit here. Now, if you have a really close look, you can see where the axle tube was pressed down to, and you can see this old oil and grease and muck that's in here where the axle tube didn't quite come up right against this shoulder. Now, I want to show you that in this big Warner diff as well, because that scum and old oil and carbon is also trapped inside this diff here, because the original axle tubes didn't go right up against the shoulder. So I'll show you inside here now. You can see the shoulder up inside here, and you can see it's nice and clean. Where the axle tube used to go into was about 10 mil shy of that shoulder. Now it's very important that you do get that area nice and clean. because the next part I'm going to show you is really, really interesting. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to measure the distance inside the diff here from shoulder to shoulder. So I'm just going to pop the tape measure in there and mind my head, just read off what it says there. Okay, that's 204 millimeters from shoulder to shoulder. So I'm going to measure both of these axle tubes. So that one measures 546. So we've got 546. We've got 204 for our differential. And the second tube is right on 540. 540. 6 and 4 is 10. Twice 4 are 8 and 9. 1290. Now, what are the odds? The original Sigma diff, when I measured this before I cut it, is 1290 from flange to flange. If you press these tubes in until they hit the shoulder inside that diff, you will get 1290. What are the odds? I love this. I love the way this has worked out. Now, you remember this little alignment jig that I made? We're ready for that now. So I'm just going to pop that onto the diff here. And this is what's going to align our axle tube with the diff, with our new diff center. So this is the right hand side axle tube. So I'm just going to pop him in there just roughly. It does just start in the hole. There we go. Now what we're going to do is we're going to sight down that and down that, which is the way that I made the jig in the first place. I've bolted our jig, our sighting jig on there. I've tapped the axle tube in. It's just in there about 5-8 mil, and I've sighted along this and our jig, and I've also sighted to the other side as well, and it's all pretty good. So the next step now will be to put it in the press and press the two axle tubes right up to that lip that we measured up before. Because once this axle tube hits that lip, we will have exactly the right length for our Sigma diff. There is one other thing that you can do as well to check that both these axle tubes are precisely aligned with each other. And that is to clamp a long piece of metal to the back face here, to do it on the other side, and then sight across them. If you use quite a long piece of metal, any variance will be exaggerated by the length of the metal. So I'll clamp those on now and we'll sight up along them. I've got our pieces of, it's just scrap metal, you can just use a couple of bits of angle line. So I've got two pieces clamped on here. I've got a dark piece and a light piece, so you get a contrast between the two of them. Now, if we sight up from that side along the two of them, you'll see we've got some pretty good alignment going there. So next step, put it in the press, press the axle tubes home. About halfway through the press, we'll recheck that we're still nicely lined up, just in case the axle tubes want to skew a bit as they go in. They won't, but we will double check it anyway. The diff's in the press now. We've left our two bits of scrap metal on here so we can sight down it. So we'll start pressing it in, but at any moment I can just get up here, have a sight down onto the bottom one and make sure that we're still perfectly in alignment. So hook the air up now, start pressing it in. We've got it all pressed together now. The axle tubes are all the way in. They're up against that little shoulder that I spoke about earlier. So now's the moment of truth. We're going to measure it up and see whether we've got that 1290 that I measured up when the diff was still a Sigma diff. So there we go, 1290. How good is that? So you certainly don't have to guess how far to press the axle tubes in. So the next step now is to puddle weld the axle tubes in, and we've got ourselves a Sigma diff, apart of course from resplining the axles. The one thing that you must do is when you go to do the puddle welds, you have to preheat the cast iron. If you don't preheat the cast iron, when you do your weld, as the weld cools, you'll hear crack, and that'll be the cast iron cracking. So you absolutely have to preheat the cast iron before you do your puddle welds. Got the oxy ready. I'm going to warm up this area here and then do the puddle weld. Now you don't have to get this glowing red hot, but you do need to take the chill off it. So I'm going to warm it up now. I'm going to watch the axle tube inside there. When that starts going blue, that'll be about the right temperature. Then I can weld it with the MIG. But you must do the preheat. You can't skip this step. So fire up the oxy and we'll give it a warm up. Alright, so our axle tube there started to go blue. We've got plenty of heat into the cast iron there. So now I'll grab the MIG. And we'll fill it up. Alright, so we've got the first puddle weld in there. It's starting to cool down a little bit now. The other one's a little bit harder to reach because it's in behind this bracket here. But now that we've put a bit of heat into it by welding it, we don't have to put very much heat into that back one, but I still will take the precaution of running the oxy over it a little bit. So I've done the two puddle welds on the top side here. All I need to do now is turn the diff upside down, do the one on the bottom, and then I'll repeat the same process on the other side. So as long as you do your preheat, there's not a problem with doing the puddle weld. So apart from a pair of axles now, the diff's complete. Now I've already got my axles ready. These are Falcon Axles, came out of this diff obviously. I've welded them up, re-studded them to 4 stud to turn the hub down to the right size for the Sigma rotor, and I've cut the end of the axle off and done the re-spline. If you want to see how the re-spline's done, put it in the comments and I'll do a little bit of film on that as well. So that's it. I've got 2 of these axles ready to go. Put the crown wheel and pinion back in, put these in, and Sigma diff is ready to go. So thanks for tuning in.